Good morning. Jesus never fails, but the electricity might. We're going to be in Philippians chapter 4 this morning. Good to see you all. Trust you have had a wonderful week. Continue praying for camp halfway through. I know staff gets tired as they invest a lot of time and energy in the kids that they are ministering to, and continue to pray for them. 7 people saved junior week, 7 people saved last week, and that was an incredible answer to prayer. What fantastic fruit from all that has been invested this year in camp. Halfway through, continue to see how he works and guides and directs in the hearts of young people. We have been talking about real righteousness is satisfying here in verses 10 through 19 of chapter 4. And this section is a very powerful section. The biblical word for satisfaction is contentment. It means the same thing. If you look them up, they are synonymous. I want to read the whole passage here as we get into this. So we're going to read starting in verse 10 of Philippians chapter 4 down through verse 19. But I rejoice in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. Notwithstanding, ye have well done, that ye did communicate with my affliction. Now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica ye sent once and again unto my necessity, not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. But I have all and abound. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God. But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus. What an incredible statement. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, today, as we start this next section, help us to realize the importance of contentment. Everything around us tells us that our status and our standing in life is based upon the power or the authority that we have or the things that we have, and our flesh is constantly driving us to seek those things that give us pleasure and are satisfying for a little while. But Paul here had learned in situations of abundance and in situations of need and situations that seemed dark, you are always in control. And it's something that we need to realize too, that you can bless and you can withhold, you can provide, you can work. We ask that we learn to be dependent, reliant, and satisfied. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Real righteousness is satisfying. Contentment. I have a question to start off here. Sometimes do. Is it a command or is it a virtue? So when you think about contentment, you think, well, that's a virtuous quality. But is it a command? Actually, you know the answer. It's both. It's the same as holiness. Holiness is a virtue, and it's also a command. Be ye holy, and he gives us a reason, for I am holy. And we realize that that is a character trait of God, and so he wants that character trait to be emulated in our life as well. Same thing here with contentment. It is very important. Turn to Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. talking about here a virtuous part of our lifestyle. It says, let your conversation or manner of living be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Now, we look at the second part of that verse, and we even look at the second part of verse 5, and we think that this is a cry for help in time of trouble. And it can be. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And when you add into it, we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Our mind tends to jump to persecution. But is that what he started verse 5 with? He didn't start verse 5 talking about persecution. He talked about a lifestyle of covetousness or contentment. And if you think about the context of what he's saying here about being either I am going to covet a lot of things or I'm going to be content with what I have, and then you look at the rest of the verse, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, while it can be a promise of his help, and while it can be a promise of deliverance, and it is a promise of sufficiency in all things. And we do him an injustice when we jump to the conclusion that he's talking about helping us in time of trouble when somebody is persecuting us, when what he is actually saying is, in all areas of your life, in every aspect of your lifestyle, you are either going to covet things that you don't have, or you're going to look at me and realize that I am absolutely capable of providing everything that you need. I will never leave you, not even in your time of deepest need, which can be financial. And in verse 6, the result, I can boldly say, I did it my way. No, that was last week. So that I can boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Remember James' audience, our evening study. He's writing to these brethren that are Christian or Jews that are scattered abroad, and they were expecting that they were going to get help from their other brethren and that they were going to have support as they're being persecuted and moving around and transitioning in life, only to find out that no, they're not. Listen, Hebrews 13:6 is talking about that particular situation. We may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. It doesn't matter what other men do unto me. It doesn't matter the situation that they put me in. It doesn't matter that I am suffering need and nobody's helping me. Paul earlier here in Philippians, and we're going to see it again here, where folks are not coming really to his aid while he is sitting in a Roman prison, and yet he says, I can boldly say that the Lord is my helper, and we're going to see that unfold here in the passage as we talk about it. Now go to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. And starting in verse 6 and then going down through verse 11, he opens with a short, simple statement here, writing unto his protege Timothy, and then develops. 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. But thou, O man of God, flee these things and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness. Now, what's so interesting about this is he gives us two important statements here. And the first one is, you want to know what contentment is? I'm going to boil down the basic necessities of life. The basic necessities of life fall into two categories: food and clothes. Everything else is extra. We don't tend to think of that in our society today. If you don't have this, and if you don't have, and if you don't have, and if you don't have, you're really struggling. If you have food and raiment, God says you ought to be content. And if we're not content, then we're probably spending, the second thing that he addresses here is the love of money, which some people seek after. In other words, they are passionate about the pursuit of that. Notice again, every time we're in this passage, he doesn't say money is evil. He says the love of it is evil. Money is one of those necessary things in life that allows us to trade and conduct our life. It's our attitude about it and how we go about acquiring it and what value it has in our life that can be the problem. And when he ends down here, he is trying to convince them, but thou, O man of God, stop fleeing after money and making it such a big priority in your life because it just feeds covetousness. J.D. Rockefeller, how much money was going to make you happy? $1 more. What happens after you get that one? And he just looked at the guy. It's the principle, right? Well, that next dollar will be the one that satisfies. That's the covetousness that's fed from seeking after the love of money. The contrast for the godly man in verse 11, why don't you spend all your time instead following after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness? That's where we should put our time, our effort, our energy, our value. I know, it's all introduction. It's all right. Luke chapter 3. Verse 14. John the Baptist is out by the river living in the wilderness, and all these folks come out from Jerusalem, and he has this dialogue with them, and he's been teaching them these different things, and here we are in verse 14. And it says, and the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, what shall we do? And he said unto them, do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. Now, it's interesting that all of these folks keep asking John the Baptist, well, what do I need to do to be a better person? What do I need to have a proper relationship with God? And John the Baptist is going to convict the soldiers in 3 areas. And don't harm anyone. Don't abuse the power that you have been given. Don't falsely accuse anyone. Don't abuse the authority that you've been given as a Roman soldier. And thirdly, and they're probably thinking, well, man, what in the world? Be content with your wages. Listen, that's a tough thing. I don't know a whole lot of people who don't think that they're not getting paid what they're worth. I'd hate to know what the minimum wage would be if everybody was asked what they were worth. Right? I mean, it's a never-ending problem. Oh, let's raise the minimum wage to $25 because I'm worth it to flip hamburgers at McDonald's. Well, then the person who's doing something else says, listen, I spent a lot of time perfecting my craft. I think I'm worth $45 an hour. And somebody else says, well, I think I'm worth, and pretty soon you've just changed the numbers, but you're back to the same thing again. And then the guy flipping hamburgers at McDonald's says, well, if he's making $60 an hour, I should be making $35. And it starts all over again, doesn't it? Because we think we're valuable. God is trying to teach a really, really important concept here, and Paul's hammering this home to the Philippians, but he's doing it in a very masterful way. Let's turn to 2 Corinthians 12:10. We'll be done our intro. 2 Corinthians 12:10. Now this just doesn't even sound right when it hits your ears. Therefore I take pleasures in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. Paul says it's important that you understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is sometimes when we look at the list that he gives here in 2 Corinthians 12:10, you think of infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses, and we don't like anything about those words. Nasty. Keep that stuff away from me. But Paul says these are a necessary part of growth in your Christian life. And I joy in those things. Not that somebody is persecuting him, but what God is going to do with that situation is what he is reveling in. There have been times of great necessity in Paul's life. I don't think Paul's sitting in prison anywhere hungry and sore and troubled and concerned about the churches that are out there and the churches that he could be starting and thinking, woohoo, this is the best time of my life. But folks, do you realize that there were a lot of times where God had to take Paul and go, guess what? Time for prison, buddy. Paul's so on fire, wide open, ready to go, he would have taken a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th missionary journey. But instead, God said, I got another job for you. I want you to write all these epistles to the churches, because when I take you out of here, I want you to be the one who pens what I tell you to write, so that you can share it, and so that they can share it with each other. And year after year after year, century after century, when you're gone, they have my word given through your perspective. Let's go back to Philippians 4:10. This is an interesting verse. I call it the confidence of contentment. The confidence of contentment. What's so interesting is it sounds like he is rebuking them when we read it in the English, and you're like, oh man, Paul, just take them out to the woodshed and spank their old hind end. That is not what he's doing here at all. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. What Paul is doing as he is starting off this statement, and it flows all the way down through verse 19, and he says, you have to understand one very critical principle. All provision comes from God. James 1:17, every good gift and every perfect gift. If it's good in your life, if it's worthwhile in your life, it didn't come from you, mom and dad, granddad, anybody else that happened to provide it. Every single good gift, every perfect gift comes from one place and one place only: God. It's the same concept as when David committed sin against Bathsheba, and we know that Uriah the Hittite died, and we know that other people were affected, and yet when Nathan the prophet comes and addresses him, David's response is, I have sinned against thee and thee only, God. And there were probably people who, if they were listening to him, would go, dude, I mean, Uriah's not here to apologize to you, but I'm pretty sure you owe him a big apology. Ahithophel's your great counselor. That's her granddad. I'm pretty sure you owe him an apology. Maybe her dad and mom, and maybe. No, the concept is that even though we offend other people, all sin is against God. And the concept here that is very important to this command and this virtue is that if we are going to be content, we have to understand that all provision comes from God. In Ezra chapter 7, verse 9, they are finally allowed to go back to Jerusalem. They've been in the Babylonian captivity for a long time. And as they are getting ready to travel, it's not the greatest time in the world to travel, and it's a long journey, and they have young ones with them, and when they finally get back to Jerusalem, Ezra writes, and we arrived in Jerusalem by the good hand of my God. In Ezra chapter 8 and verse 18, they are trying to get stuff together for the temple and institute proper worship again, because we do not want to have to get drugged back to Babylon and have our butts whooped in the woodshed again. We're not ever going to allow that to happen. So from now on, we're going to worship God properly. Let's get out the book of the law. We're going to read it, and we're going to worship him the way we're supposed to. And they start looking around, and they have all kinds of people that are ready and willing to minister, but they cannot find a Levite. And that's a big problem. So in Ezra chapter 8 and verse 18, they send messengers and they're praying and they're like, we got to have a Levite. And when this guy shows up, it says, and God gave us someone with wisdom and understanding so that we could worship God properly. That man was provided by the good hand of God. Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 7, same thing. Boy, we have to somebody who's going to lead us in worship and teach us to do the thing right by the good hand of God. Why? I mean, just in traveling from Babylon to Jerusalem, yes, in every area of our life, contentment starts with the ground level understanding that any good provision that comes in our life comes from God and God only. I have a beat up rusted truck that I drive. Have a hard time getting rid of it because it was given to me. I was in school one day and a gentleman walked in and said, "Can I see you?" and handed me a title to a truck. Doesn't happen very often in that one Christian movie, but it doesn't happen very often. Listen, there was an individual that handed it to me and his signature was on the title because he's the one that owned the truck. But you want to know who it came from? You do know, right? Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 8. How are we going to rebuild if we don't have any supplies? And so I'm going to go to the king, who's a long way away, and I'm going to say, we're going to have some building supplies. And he's going to tell me that you can go down there and cut down my cedar trees that are in Lebanon and use them for building. And Nehemiah says that happens by the good hand of God. Because God moved in somebody's heart to make it happen. Now, what Paul's going to do here in verse 10 is he's going to use the example of the Philippians to show the good hand of God and how God moves in providing for needs. All provision comes from God. Here's the testimony of past provision. The Philippians have helped him over and over again. Down through here, they allude to times, even in Thessalonica, you once and again helped. We can read about that in Acts chapter 17. And in verses 1 through 13, Paul leaves them and he goes to Thessalonica, and there's all kinds of trouble there. And then he ends up moving down to Berea, and those folks accept him, and he starts a church, and he spends some time there. And then in verses 14 through Acts chapter 18, he's going to go to Athens and try and start a church, and he has all kinds of problems. And he goes to Corinth, and he has problems, and they start a church. But we know from 1 and 2 Corinthians that, man, they are a church fraught with all kinds of sin problems. And he doesn't want to be beholden to any of these folks. And it's interesting that if you cross-reference all through the New Testament, you will find out that the Philippians had a very special relationship with Paul. From the very first time he showed up and started the church, they were bonded together. And as he moves about, whether it's Thessalonica or whether it's Berea or whether it's Athens or whether it's Corinth, and even later on, they are sending him gifts and they are helping him in the ministry. Their testimony of past provision was pretty incredible. But I want you to look at 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 9, because there's an important concept here that's necessary to understanding the rest of Philippians 4:10. In 2 Corinthians 11, in verse 9, it says, "And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. Now hold on right there. He's writing to the Corinthian church, right? This is the fourth church that I mentioned in Acts 17 and 18. The folks that came from Macedonia, that's the Philippian church. So he doesn't want to ask the Corinthians to help him with keeping up his life. The Macedonian churches are bringing the supplies that Paul needs so he can minister to the Corinthians. And he says, and in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. Paul was having difficult times while he was in Corinth financially. We know from other passages that there were times that he had to go back to making tents so he could sell the tents and get money to work. The only problem with that is all the time that he is putting into building tents, he's not in the synagogues, and he's not in the marketplace, and he's not going house to house, and he's not writing epistles, because he's sitting there sewing tents together and he's making tents. And the Philippians are saying, listen, Paul has a great need, and if he has to go back to building tents while he's at Corinth, how in the world is he ever going to reach that town? And so they take up an offering and they send money over to him to, to meet his financial need, about to die. The testimony of past provision is really important to understanding this verse. So go back to Philippians chapter 4, because even though it sounds like he is being harsh to them, he's not. And he says several things that tell you he is not. The timing of present provision is what he is exploding here in this verse. But I rejoiced in the Philippians greatly. Is that what your verse says? What does your verse say? Okay, you remember the foundation, right? The foundation is that all provision comes from God. So his rejoicing then is in whom? Exactly. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at the last, doesn't that sound harsh? Almost sounds like he's writing to the Philippian church and he's saying, buddy, I'll tell you what, it's about time. I mean, every rib is showing. I can't stay warm. I don't have the materials to write with. I can't. What in the world is taking you so long? When we read it in the English, it's real easy to fall into that and think that Paul's saying, well, at last you finally showed up to do something about this. But that's not what he's saying. He's not saying it seems like it was late in coming. It has been about 10 years that have passed since the church was founded at Philippi. And for a long time, we looked at it, the support flowed, and then it stopped. And you say, well, maybe he is telling them, well, it's about time. No, he's not. Look at the very next phrase. That now at the last your care for me hath flourished again. This is a very, very important term. This is an agricultural term. It's used to describe perennial plants and trees. Perennial plants and trees lie dormant during the winter, right? Are they dead? We say they're dead. Oh man, all the trees have died because the leaves fall off, but they're not dead, or they wouldn't come back in the spring. What he is saying is, in the springtime, and we watch this, I love to watch it, it pops out again and flourishes. By whose design? Do we have anything to do with it? And that's exactly what Paul is writing to the Philippians here in verse 10. He says, I rejoice in God greatly, now that at the last, which makes it sound like, boy, almost didn't get the gift here, for I starved to death. It's not what he's saying. You flourished again. In other words, what Paul is writing to the Philippians is saying, do you realize that God had you dormant for a little while, but by his design and his design only, for some reason unknown to us, you found out that I was in dire straits in Rome. And like a flower or a tree in springtime, you burst to life and did something about it. It's a God thing and only a God thing. Why? Why did it take him so long? Well, he goes on and he says, wherein ye were also careful. What's interesting here is he uses two words, and actually, he doesn't use two words. He uses the same word twice in one phrase. And what he is saying here is the word here, wherein, and careful are the same word. Well, he's trying to tell them, it literally means to exercise the mind, to be sentimental, to interest oneself in, to set one's affection on. In other words, what he's writing to the Philippian church is, you were very interested in my ministry. You cared about me a great deal. You followed me. You got the missionary letters. You were praying for me. You helped in this church, and then in this church, and then in this church, and then in this church. And for a long time, you blessed my ministry, and you provided financially, and then it stopped. And we are prone to think that the reason that it stopped is because they no longer cared about Paul. And the interesting thing about this verse is Paul is writing to them and he says, I know for a fact that that is not true. You flourished again. You popped out when God ordained that it was the right time for you to help me again, just like a tree that has been dormant all winter long. And for a period of years, you weren't supplying my need. And now all of a sudden, boom, Epaphroditus walks into my jail cell loaded with gifts. And Paul has no idea he's coming. He didn't get a text or a phone call. He didn't get up that morning and look on Facebook and say, hang on, Paul, Epaphroditus is coming. Oh, let me track him while he sails and rides and drives. And Paul is dealing with his daily difficulties, and in walks Epaphroditus. When Paul writes back to them, he says, I so greatly rejoice in God because he brought you out of dormancy and provided this incredible need. You flourished again, even though I know the entire time you have been very concerned about me. What an incredible, incredible testimony to the church at Philippi. They always cared about Paul, and they were always concerned for Paul. I would imagine he was probably the subject of much prayer. I don't know if he was ever the missionary of the month or if he was like the only missionary that they prayed for. Anybody heard from Paul? And what's interesting is we continue, it says, but ye lacked opportunity. That word means it was unseasonable. In other words, it wasn't the proper occasion. And so while the church at Philippi was always concerned about Paul, and they always wanted to be able to minister to Paul and help him as he's running around doing his things, again, who is in control? God is. And Paul says, you popped up and supplied this need, but I understand that for a number of years, it was unseasonable. You lacked opportunity. It wasn't the right occasion for you to act. And so God didn't have you act. That's what he's telling them. Why did they stop supporting Paul for several years? Well, we know it's not because they didn't care, but there's probably two different reasons. It's quite possible they may have lost track of him. I mean, come on now. Paul moved farther and farther away in ministry, and he moved farther and faster than probably anybody alive at that time. Keeping track of Paul was not an easy task. He went back to Jerusalem at one point to report, and then he took a third missionary journey. And when he went back to Jerusalem, he probably didn't have needs because you have a big church there, and they were probably taking care of Paul. He takes off on his third missionary journey. I would imagine the Philippine church wanted to know where Paul was and what he was doing and how things were going. But it was pretty difficult to get word back then, right? Somebody had to come driving through and say, hey, I heard Paul was down in Sicily. It's slow getting news. News traveled with people, and people took weeks or months to get places, especially during the bad season, right? We see that on Paul's way to prison. If I were you, I wouldn't set sail, but they set sail, and they sailed right into Euroclydon, and the next thing you know, they're months having all kinds of trouble. I would say there were a lot of people concerned about Paul during that time. Wouldn't you think? I mean, nobody knows where he is. There's no news coming in saying Paul's down in Clintwood having a revival service. He's over at Camp Evangel speaking. No. I mean, there's radio silence on Paul. Why? Because he's shipwrecked on an island getting snake bit. And nobody knows to pray about it. And eventually, Paul's in prison. And while he's in prison in Rome, we know that he had very few visitors, so there weren't a whole lot of people who were running around telling folks, oh yeah, Paul's in prison at. And the other thing that was easy to realize is Paul's not grabbing headlines by starting riots or new churches. I mean, those are the two things he was best at, right? Everywhere the man went, he either started a church or he started a riot. And if people are going to be talking downtown, or they're going to gather in the vineyard, or they're threshing wheat, or they're whatever, you know the topic of conversation and over again would have been, was Paul starting a church or was he starting a riot? And maybe both. But if he's sitting in prison in Rome, he's not starting riots in Ephesus, he's not starting churches, and so you don't have people running around going, well, yeah, I heard Paul down there at... There's not a lot of news about Paul. It would have been very easy during this time period for them to lose track of him. But there's another reason. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. While they are providing to the Corinthian church, the fourth church that he was ministering to in Acts 17 and 18, we learn of the situation that they are dealing with themselves, and that is that they were suffering a great deal also. Look at verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy, and their, what's it say? It doesn't say a little bit of need. It says what? And yet their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Listen, they had been supporting Paul at Corinth so he wouldn't have to work. And they were in dire need themselves. Deep poverty. Word would come in, Paul's doing such and such, and folks would throw in, remind you of the widow who walks into the temple and casts 2 mites into the treasury and boot gangs it because she's embarrassed she doesn't have more to give. And then you got this self-righteous, sanctimonious dude standing over there making this big deal and chucking in his money sack so it makes as much noise as possible. And Jesus is standing there watching the thing, and he says, that woman right there has given more to God than that Pharisee ever will. Because she gave out of deep poverty. She just chucked into the treasury all that she had. Man, she should have been taken out of the treasury when the plate was passed. That's what all kinds of people would have been thinking. Listen, that's the Philippian church. They're taking up an offering to meet Paul. Wait a second. Instead of taking up an offering to meet Paul's needs, maybe some of the churches Paul has been starting in the book of Acts should have been taking up an offering to meet the Philippians' needs. But isn't it interesting that when he's getting ready to go to Jerusalem and word spreads throughout Asia, and all these churches start responding, guess who jumps in and responds with their money too? Verse 3, for to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power. They were willing of themselves. And he goes on all the way down through verse 15, and he talks about how this struggling church that didn't have any money over and over and over again reached down in their pockets and gave what they could not afford to give for him and for the sake of the gospel, because they loved God greatly. I think by the time he was done in Corinth and he was going on in his travels, they not only probably lost track of him, but they had given so much they didn't have anything to give, folks. And God had to say, enough's enough. It's dormant time. It's time for somebody else. I'm gonna meet Paul's needs with somebody else, Philippians. You've done enough for now. Provision. Word provision comes from two Greek words. One means pro, which is before, and video, which means to see. In other words, the word means God sees it beforehand. But it's much more than that, because he doesn't just see it. He prepares the provision beforehand. We're not going to turn there. We don't have the time. But two passages that come to mind. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 10 through 14. Jews are being persecuted, and they're going to try and hang Mordecai and a whole bunch of the rest of them, right? And here's this man who has been faithfully ministering and who has saved the king's life, but the king doesn't even realize what's going on. You got this underhanded scheme to try and wipe out the Jews. Hitler and Mussolini and the others that were not the first. It's been going on for a long time, folks. Mordecai is Esther's uncle. Is that right? Yeah. Haman's got this underhanded scheme, and he writes to his niece, who has been taken into the palace and made queen, and says, listen, you need to go in and approach the king and beseech him on our behalf. And she writes back to him and sends him back to him and says, do you not understand that if you walk into the king's presence and he hasn't invited you, they take you outside and kill you? Go home this afternoon and read it. Esther chapter 4, verses 10 through 14. There's a famous phrase in there that we like to quote, but you miss it if you just skip to the phrase itself. Haman writes back to her and says, do you realize that if you keep your mouth shut, all of your father's house is going to die, and eventually they're going to find out you're a Jew and you're going to die too? It's one of those Daniel things. Once the law's passed, what's the king supposed to do? Do you not realize, Esther, that God has been working in your life for such a time as this? So the question that passage is begging us, if God were pointing his finger at us and saying, do you not realize that I have prepared you for such a time as this? The question is, will you reap the reward? That's why we have the book of Esther, right? Could have gone down a whole lot differently. And listen, Mordecai understands exactly what God's doing, because when he responds to Esther, he says, if you don't do this, then salvation is going to come from someone else. God is not going to stand by and watch his people decimated. but you and your father's house are going to be gone. And before this thing starts going internationally, God will raise up someone else, Esther, but you can stop it right now because he raised you up for such a time as this. Are you going to have to make him raise up somebody else? Are you going to reap the reward, or are you going to suffer the consequences of rejecting a divine opportunity? It's quite possible that you are God's prepared provision. Have you ever thought about it that way? Because Esther hadn't yet until Mordecai brought it to life. Genesis chapter 50, Joseph has been taken down to Egypt. His father passes away, and the kids are worried. Uh-oh. Dad's the one that's been keeping Joseph from acting. He has all the power. He has all the authority. He is well-liked, well-loved. We are in trouble now. And in verses 19 through 21, Joseph says to him, no, you don't understand. You meant it for evil. He calls it what it is. You meant it for evil. I know what your intentions were. I fully understand exactly what you wanted for me, and that's okay because God was in charge of that too. And while you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Now you think about Joseph. Listen, God could have sold him into slavery for Potiphar, and Potiphar could have, immediately brought him to Pharaoh's attention, and Pharaoh could have just promoted him, and we wouldn't have to have all the years in Potiphar's house, and we wouldn't have to have all the years in prison. But when you realize that God is the source of all provision, and his timing is not my timing, Paul can write to the Philippian church, and he says, I so greatly rejoice in God that at last you have sprang forth with this gift like a tree that was asleep. Because my timing isn't God's timing. And even though you wanted to, and you care very much about me, and you've been trying to follow me, you lack the opportunity. And without Paul even knowing, and probably without Paul even suspecting, because I would imagine it's been a while since he's heard from the Philippian church, the door opens and in walks Epaphroditus. That's a God thing. Are we looking for that? Or are we spending all of our time in covetousness? See, Paul starts off this whole thing, and he says, I want you to understand what contentment really is. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, I pray that in our lives we are not so busy trying to do everything ourselves and trying to do it our own way and in our own timing, that we are totally unaware that you are at work always trying to bring about that which is good for us. Not what seems good, not what feels good, not what looks good, but what is truly good and perfect in our life. And as we are going to continue to see in the weeks ahead, sometimes in Paul's life, that was difficulty and distress and financial need. And yet all those things brought about a vibrant relationship with you, total dependence upon you. Father, help us to trust in your character, to cling to it, to value it, to love it, and to worship you properly because of it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.